How much money has the Clinton Foundation raised and given away and spent?
I think the estimate is over 2 billion probably at this point. They've been in operation really since he was in the White House. They opened the foundation to try to raise money for his presidential library initially in 1998, I think. So it's now been operating for almost 20 years. It ramped up a lot after he left the White House and started to raise money to do other things, principally to deal with HIV and AIDS in the underdeveloped world. And the great bulk of the money that's been raised and spent by the foundation has been that. There are a bunch of other projects he's done, and they built the library, Presidential Center in Little Rock, and that cost, I think, well over 200 million by itself.
So who has been impacted by this money?
Well, so there are, I think now, estimated more than 11 million people who get life-saving HIV/AIDS medication from Clinton's, his project, the AIDS project that he does, which is now called the Clinton Health Access Initiative. And so over the years, that has saved millions of lives. They also have started initiatives against tuberculosis, malaria, principally in Africa, and hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people have been affected by those initiatives as well.
So how does an NGO such as the Clinton Foundation work with a government?
Well, so when he left the White House and eventually decided that he was going to take on the AIDS problem as a principal focus of his post-presidency, someone at the behest of Nelson Mandela, who joined with him in this, the first thing he had to confront was that Western governments and the global public health establishment had decided not to do anything about this. It was considered too expensive. You just could not buy enough AIDS medications of the kind that was available then, that was beginning to make AIDS a chronic disease rather than a fatal disease in the West. You couldn't do that in Africa because they didn't have the money to pay for it. And one of the things that he had to do was to raise the money to buy cheaper versions of those drugs generically, which is another issue that he confronted. And that money came from governments. It came from governments that in the beginning were headed by friends of his, people that he'd gotten to know as president. The Prime Minister of Canada, Jean Chrétien at the time, the Taoiseach of Ireland, Bertie Ahern, others, the head of the government in Norway. These were governments that had the money, and he would call these leaders on the phone or go and see them and say, I'm going to put together a project because it's a moral outrage that we're going to let tens of millions of people die from this disease that we know how to stop. We know how to keep people alive because there supposedly isn't enough money. Are you in? And those leaders started to write those checks, and the money went through his foundation. At the same time, he was arranging the production of those pharmaceuticals in India, mostly in India, a little bit in Africa, with ingredients from China, and arranged a supply chain that would make them much cheaper. The way he could do that was to say to the manufacturers, I have a guaranteed flow of money. I will have a guaranteed flow of money to buy a big volume from you. So you will still make a lot of money producing these drugs at a much lower cost. And that was how it worked.
Does the country have Clinton fatigue at this point?
Well, I heard somebody told me today that everywhere Hillary Clinton goes, she gets a standing ovation now. So they may be fatigued of someone else by now after 50 days. But, I don't know that there's Clinton fatigue. I think there's some fatigue with politics in general. I think people are kind of exhausted watching TV. The election left a lot of people depressed and angry in different ways. Certainly, she got a share of blame for the way the election turned out from people who wished that she had won and were mystified by the fact that she lost the election even though she won the popular vote. So certainly, with any public figure who is around for as long as they've been around, you will go through peaks and troughs. And we were probably in a trough right after the election, but as I said, I think people are looking at her a little differently now that they found out what the alternative is like.